Welcome to this presentation of the OboxPlanet Seminar. It is the end product of 45 years of passion for the idea of freedom, and I cannot wait for your feedback. As you probably already know, we are going to take a trip on an imaginary planet called the OboxPlanet. And here are the steps for today. The introduction helps you understand what you will see on the planet, and then we look at a few situations on the planet together, and after that you can explore some parts that interest you most and share your discoveries with us. And finally you'll get some literature tips, an award as a OboxPlanet tourist guide if you deserve it. We take a total of 2 hours and a 15-minute break after 45 minutes. Now this interactive part we will of course skip for the movie. I will ask the participants where they stand on the political spectrum with the aid of the tool Mentimeter, and then jump to the first presentation topic. In this next part I want to help young people realize something important. The nation state, which today feels so natural and obvious, is actually a very new idea in human history. For thousands of years, people lived in tribes, villages, kingdoms or city-states, but the idea of the modern nation-state is only a few centuries old. And the question, of course, is this the end? Is Francis Fukuyama right when he famously declared our system to be the end of history? Or is my friend David Dürr right, who also sees an end, but with different consequences for the state? With Switzerland as an example, I want to illustrate the enormous growth of the state. In 1850, about 3 francs had to be paid in taxes for every 100 francs of income. Today, it is about 32 francs plus compulsory health insurance and pension fund contributions. In real terms per capita, growth is even clearer. While income has grown 14-fold since 1850, government spending per person has increased 150-fold. And here we can see what the money is spent on: retirement pensions, welfare, health, education and public transportation. Most of these expenditures items are relatively new. The classical state functions of protecting life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness take up just 6% of all the state budgets. "6% of 32% is 2% of 100%. Today, 2 francs per 100 francs of income costs the protection of life and property. We will come back to these 2% later. Now we get to the out-of-the-box thinking. Try to think of a political topic and how it is discussed today. Take immigration, health, education, whatever. We take the current situation and then we ask ourselves whether we need more or fewer laws, more or less taxes, in short, more or less state involvement. That's exactly what we want to tackle differently today. We take individual problems and metaphorically put them into a box and look for solutions outside the box. This outside of the box thinking is needed in business life when you're looking for new original ideas outside the familiar box. Strictly speaking, we do not just put individual topics but the whole world into a box, close the lid and respectfully put it aside for a moment. Now, outside the box, let's imagine a planet, the OboxPlanet. It's copy-paste the Earth, has same size, seas, continents, animals and even people, but it lacks one thing: there are no states. No legislators, no bureaucracy, no taxes and no military. And of course questions immediately arise: who builds the roads? Who takes care of the poor? Who ensures law and order? And how would COVID have been tackled without the state? That's exactly what we find out with a visit to the planet. So off we go to the intermediate station of the orbital base. Now you might think this is an exotic, crazy idea of mine, but that would be too much honor. The idea of the OboxPlanet is mine, but the idea of a world without a state, the so-called private law society, has been around for a long time. To be more precise, it's been around for about 50 years and comes from the USA. In the USA, the state grew until it came under attack with the Vietnam War and the ineffective social programs. And in times of crisis, extreme solutions are usually presented. The one extreme solution, namely much more state, was not very original and not very popular because there was the bad example of the communist Eastern Bloc. And that's why various scientists ask themselves at the same time, what happens if you privatize all state functions? I will come back to these pioneers in the picture at the end when I present the reading list. Since the 1970s, there has been a rapidly growing number of studies and books. And of course, in real politics, we have the political milestone with the election of Javier Milei as the president of Argentina. Milei says quite openly and consistently that such a stateless private law society is his inspiration. It's the opposite of the socialist utopia, the liberal lodestar. Interestingly, he has the most success among young voters, with 70% voting for him under the age of 25. And now we arrive at the orbital base. Here we learn the important rules of the game on the Obox planet, because we know from sports it's just much more fun when we know the rules of the game. As you can see here, there are very few rules. And the nicest thing about the Obox planet, there are no new rules, but only fewer. And that of course makes sense. We also have people, private individuals on the Obox planet with rules in private dealings. But we do lack people with state functions, so we have no state laws, no regulations, orders and prohibitions. Stop, you might think. That's not possible. We need someone who makes the rules for traffic, in the economy, and to make sure that the strong don't oppress the weak. Of course, that's true. There is, of course, exactly the same need for order and law, but that is not proof that only the state can provide it. So what are the rules on the Obox planet? We can illustrate it like this. The Obox planet sits on a stool with 3 legs. The seat is the supreme principle, and the 3 legs are 3 applications of this principle. The principle is called the Zero Aggression Principle, ZAP, and the 3 applications are property, contract, and the neutral judge. The principle holds the 3 pillars together and gives a common denominator. It's like the law of gravity in physics. It also limits the other laws and gives a common denominator. Now let's look first at the supreme principle, the Zero Aggression Principle. You might have heard of the older term non-aggression principle, NAP. ZAP is just a bit zappier, and the picture should make it clear that it revolves around the spirit of peaceful coexistence. ZAP means you can do whatever you want as long as you don't threaten or do violence to anyone else. No stealing, no threats, no violence except for self-defense. If violence is such an important concept, we want to define it clearly. Aggression or coercion in this context means the threat or use of physical force, especially unpleasant and uninvited physical force. So, not okay are robbery, abduction, rape, murder, fraud. But if you go on a boxing match or other violent games, it's okay as long as they remain voluntary. And here are some examples of interactions in private life. When we act, sing, discuss, work, play, everything is allowed as long as it remains peaceful. This is exactly what the ZAP means. So much about the ZAP or ZAPI. And one thing is clear, even on the Obox planet there are evil people, criminals who violate the ZAPI, the so-called pricks, double meaning intended. The prick interferes in all areas. He steals and hurts people, falsifies contracts, and he tries to corrupt the judiciary. For time reasons, I have made a separate presentation on YouTube, for which I greatly appreciate feedbacks on the prick and how to deal with the prick. Now let's look at the 3 legs: property, contract, and neutral judge. Because if we understand these terms, the Obox planet becomes very easy to understand. Step 1, property. On OboxPlanet there is no state, everything is private property. So the big question is, how can I get property without breaking the zero aggression principle, ZAP? In other words, how can I own something without harming someone else's property or body? It's actually very simple. If I find something that belongs to no one and I start using it peacefully, it becomes mine. Why? Because if nobody owned it before, I am not taking it away from anyone. Logic and fair. Historically, this was mostly about land, but it also works for animals, plants, or natural resources, and it does not have to be just one person. In Switzerland, for example, many forests and mountains, meadows belong to cooperatives or communities. The specific word for this is homesteading. For hundreds of years, philosophers have discussed what counts as real appropriation, like mixing your labor with the land, farming it, or fencing it so that others can see that it's being used. That is also why your body belongs to you, because you were the first one to use it. So now we have private property, and the next question, of course, what can I do with my property? So we're back to the stool and the ZAP principle. I can do anything as long as I do not harm the property of or body of any other. That is, I can smash my own vase with the hammer, but I cannot smash your vase, and definitely not your head. And I can also give my property away, lend it, or share my property. Which brings us to the second big topic, the contract. Step 2, contract. So what is a contract and why do we need it? A contract is simply an agreement that makes clear who owns what. We usually need it when property changes hands, fully, partially, or just for a while. Example, you give me an apple, I give you an egg. You give me the money, I'll let you use my car for one day. We start a company together with clear shares of who owns what. To avoid confusion, we often write down what we mean. And now, can a contract say anything? Yes, as long as it follows the zero aggression principle. We're back to the ZAP. No force, no aggression. That means we cannot make a contract that allows me to beat up our neighbor. Do we always have to write everything down? No. There are also silent contracts when it's obvious from the actions, and oral contracts, spoken agreements. Both can still count. But this brings us to the next challenge, conflict resolution. What if we understand the contract differently? Or what if there is no contract at all? Step 3, the neutral judge. Why do we need a neutral judge? Well, if you and I disagree, we can take a third person for help, maybe a mediator or a judge. But here is the key. This third person must not be part of the conflict. Imagine if I had a fight with you and at the same time I decide who is right. Every little kid would see that this is unfair. That is why neutrality is so important. The judge must stand outside the conflict to make a fair decision. And here is something important to note. Having a neutral judge is not as obvious as it seems. In fact, this is the big difference and the greatest problem with the state. The state is often both a conflict party and the judge in its own case. It's like playing a game where the referee is also one of the players. Totally unfair. And this thought leads us straight into our next chapter. We take now one last look back at the Earth, because I argue none of us are aware just how different it is there. We can illustrate the difference like this. Now we already know the picture on the right. What is the difference to the picture on the left? On the right we have the OboxPlanet, on the left we have the Earth. The Earth has a fourth pillar, namely the state, and this state interferes in all other areas, in property, freedom and contract and justice, via the so-called MOC, the monopoly of coercion. So the ZAP here has competition from the MOC. We have, of course, also the private criminal on both planets, to which we come in a separate chapter. So let's look at the MOC. Who is the MOC? MOC is simply called monopoly of coercion. monopoly of force, and that is the essence, the nature of the state. The state makes laws, and every law must have a sanction, a threat of violence via fines and, if necessary, imprisonment. A law without a fine is not a law, or without a threat of fine. The state also has a separate legal system, the public law. So we have the public sector mock and the private sector zap on the seat, and they are continually fighting for supremacy. This fight has a name, namely politics. And every new law, every regulation, every tax and every government order is at the expense of private freedom, of private room for maneuver. Of course, the friends of the state have many reasons for the state and its orders, but this justification of state intervention is not the issue today. At the moment, we simply want to see where we are today, where the state is intervening, and what we have to forget on the Obox planet. Let's take a look at a typical day. We are woken up by an alarm clock that runs on state-produced electricity. This is followed by a shower with water from the public water system, heated with highly taxed, regulated and sanctioned natural gas. The vitamin tablets after brushing our teeth, regulated and partly prohibited because not certified. At breakfast we have bread, butter, bacon, milk, eggs, everything regulated, everything taxed, partially subsidized at the same time. The way to work or to school is by public transport or on state roads. At work, whether it's a small business or a large corporation, permits, bureaucracy, accounting, regulations, tax documents. Take a moment and look around you. Everything you can touch, hear, taste, see is taxed. I would like to give you 3 examples and show that such laws have both direct and indirect consequences. Our rules of life, the 10 Commandments, needs about 70 words or 2 stone tablets. The rules for a nation, the American Declaration of Independence, used around 1,300 words on a paper scroll. While the European regulation for the labeling of the energy consumption of vacuum cleaners uses about 32,000 words on 96 A4 pages. Now this is a one-time nuisance for existing producers and a piece of cake for large companies. But it hinders newcomers, inventors, small companies and importers who just may say to themselves that it's not worth it. Competition and especially innovation and improvement are hampered. It's also what Trump means by non-tariff trade barriers. The relatively free USA has 2,500 pages of tax laws and 70,000 pages of supplementary regulations, instructions, court rulings and authority commentaries, i.e. what the tax advisors really have to consider. Here too, small businesses are particularly affected. Just ask any small business, even in Switzerland. In addition, tax considerations cause huge bad investments, lead to less willingness to take risks, innovation, investments, and leads to constructs for tax avoidance like offshore accounts and letterbox companies. And last but not least, tax laws give the state a means by which they can harass any political undesirable citizen, association, or company. And here, for a fun fact, the highest marginal tax rate was 90% in the USA until the 1960s, i.e. from every additional dollar of income, the tax office took 90 cents. It was easily worth wasting $500,000 to hide $1 million in income. Third example on how corruption arises and is perpetuated. The Peruvian economic professor Hernando de Soto had his students register a small clothing store in a slum. Legally, exactly as required by the state. The result, it took 289 days and required over 200 bureaucratic steps at various offices. This means that there are practically no legally registered small businesses in Peru. They remain illegal, susceptible to blackmail, and without creditworthiness. And this is the situation in countless countries, and let's not kid ourselves. When politicians announce that they will take energetic action against corruption, we can expect that in a short time a number of unpleasant political opponents will end up in prison. The corruption jungle consists of laws and bureaucracy, and as long as no libertarians comes along with a chainsaw, it will continue to proliferate and flourish. We don't need these extreme examples. Even the countless small, inconspicuous regulations can stifle the spirit of life. Elon Musk said it very, very nicely on Joe Rogan. Quote, "It's like Gulliver, where you get caught by all these little strings and there is just so many regulations until you cannot move anymore. There is a hardening of the arteries of civilization, and it becomes more and more difficult to do anything at all, and in the end there is nothing more you can do." To sum this part up, the per capita income in economically free countries is about 10 times higher than in the non-free countries. Now, what does this look like on the Obox planet? Because even here, even in the freest countries, we have the countless regulations just mentioned. On the Obox planet, without obstacles, we would definitely be somewhere up here, as far as average income goes. Another perspective is the consequences for personal life planning, and this is where it gets really exciting. Career and pension planning, desire to marry and have children, residence, home ownership or rent, self-employment or employee, saving and bequeathing or squandering assets. All areas are guided, restricted or prohibited by law, regulations, taxes, prohibitions, etc. Here are a couple short examples. Old age provision was created as a safety net for the few needy who reached retirement age. In the meantime, it has become a hammock for pensioners who naturally expect fewer and fewer young people to finance more and more old people. We have forgotten to ask, what is even desirable about changing from one day to the other, from 100% work to put it bluntly, social uselessness? And how will the relationship of pensioners to young people develop if they have to pay more and more in social security? How would that be without government regulations? Family planning quickly comes down to the question of to be or not to be. Our younger two children are not allowed to exist according to Swiss reproductive laws. For in artificial insemination, as everywhere else, there are regulations and recommendations regarding age, technology, egg and sperm donation, etc. This sounds like dry administration, but in the end it is politicians and bureaucrats deciding on life or non-life. Speaking of which, the bill for abortions in Switzerland is financed by compulsory health insurance premiums. And finally, an illustration of my assertion that political reality surpasses even the most absurd fantasies. In the 1990s, the Swiss Federal Council proposed that grandparents needed an official permit, foster child license, if they regularly take care of their grandchildren. Fortunately, the expression "granny's license" made good headlines, otherwise this would be reality today. Question: what would your life and family planning look like without a state retirement age, marriage laws, settlement regulations, reproductive and adoption laws, professional licenses, and much more? I would like to remind you once again that these are simply the facts. Whether and why we need a state and how big it should be is an exciting discussion, but not the topic here. I think you can see now that it takes a good deal of openness in the imagination to imagine a world without the state laws, regulations, restrictions, taxes, and regulations. And now, please buckle up again for the short transfer to Zappy Point. Which brings us to the first scene on the Obox planet, the arrival scene. Welcome to Zappy Point.